Bob asked me to speak about sort of what's going on with U.S. trade policy, the election, the possible re-election of Donald Trump, his second term. So I thought I'd get into that. As you know, if you've been following American politics at all, it had been looked like it was going to be Joe Biden against Donald Trump, that Donald Trump looked like he was in a very strong position to be elected again. And things have really changed with Kamala Harris. The polls have really evened out. It's not clear who has a lead at the moment, so it could be a tight race, and we'll just have to see how things develop. But I thought I'd talk specifically about trade policy, and of course, what that means is the U.S. putting up barriers to international trade with other countries, or are we going to keep those barriers relatively low? So let me show some slides just to start things out here. Titled this Trump 2 because it could be the return of Donald Trump to the presidency next January. We'll find out in November. At least I hope we will. So here it might be useful to think about what Donald Trump did during his first term in office between 2017 and 2021. He, came in campaigning on the fact that trade had destroyed the American middle class. Trade was a bad thing for the U.S. Trade deficits were an indicator that other countries were taking advantage of the U.S. The U.S. had up to that point a pretty open market with relatively low tariffs. Since 1985, the U.S. has had a free trade agreement with Israel. So there's been the free flow of goods and services and even data between the U.S. and Israel. But Trump had a very anti-trade stance. And so these are some of the things that he did. He had a very active trade agenda that went against the grain of where the U.S. had been moving for 50 years after World War II. First of all, he on his third day in office, he pulled the U.S. out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's now been renamed the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It did go into effect, but the U.S. did not participate and did not ratify it. That was a trade agreement linking the U.S., some North American and South American countries, and the whole Pacific Rim. And the U.S. said, we're not going to be part of this trade agreement. It's a bad agreement. He almost pulled out of KORUS, which is the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Luckily, Trump says he is a friend of Israel, so he didn't want to upset the U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement or some of the other smaller ones. But he was upset with Korea for exporting so many cars. There's an interesting story behind this, that his chief of staff pulled the paperwork from his desk so that he couldn't sign it, pulling out of KORUS. And he sort of forgot about the issue, and the U.S. later negotiated an agreement with Korea. He threatened to pull out of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And then he was convinced that wouldn't be a good idea, that he should just simply renegotiate it. So they did. They really didn't change too much, but now it's called the USMCA agreement. So they took out the word free, they took out the word trade, and they only kept agreement. So it's USMCA, US-Canada-Mexico agreement. The title doesn't even say what it is. He talked about withdrawing from the World Trade Organization. He didn't sort of move on that one so much. But in addition to pulling out of some trade agreements or renegotiating them in the ways he thought might be better, he also imposed a lot of tariffs. So there's various provisions in U.S. trade law that allow the president to impose tariffs, but the president just can't do it for any purpose whatsoever. There has to be some specific reason. So on national security grounds, tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum imports. This applied initially to everyone, including Canada and Mexico, including countries that the U.S. had a free trade agreement with. And that was later changed, but the tariffs are still in effect and have been continued by the Biden administration and are fairly stiff at about 25% or so. What got a lot of headlines was sort of the start of a trade war with China. So there's something called Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. It allows the president to retaliate against other countries for their unfair trade practices. And so we imposed pretty high tariffs, 25%, then going up to 50%, I believe, on about half of imports from China. That really didn't stop the flow of imports so much. It just diverted it to Mexico and to Vietnam and other lower cost countries. But it did obviously change things with China. China retaliated, hit U.S. farm exports, and it sort of escalated from there. The president also considered tariffs on automobiles. His time sort of ran out in office before he could do anything there, but that was something that might have been on the agenda. So the question I'm leading to is, so what is he going to pick up if he's elected in November? And there's, as I said, about a 50-50 chance, I'd say at the moment, that he'd get reelected. What might he be doing? Well, first of all, what's the background to his ideas? And it's this. So there's a famous journalist in the United States called Bob Woodward, who's known for his deep reporting and sources. And he, in one of his earlier books, took this from a memorandum or something that Trump had written. And actually, those are the president's words there, and in his handwriting: trade is bad. Well, as Bob was saying, most economists, almost all economists, believe that trade is really good. It's mutually beneficial across countries. It helps raise living standards and raise incomes. And to have a president who believes trade is bad because of what he thinks it has done to the middle class in the past is a really bizarre thing to think about. This, I hope you can see, this is just an indicator of what Trump did when he was in office. So this is the average U.S. tariff on imports, and it goes all the way back to 1790. So there's a lot of history there. But the important thing to note is that in the 1930s and 40s, little over not quite a century ago, with the Great Depression and coming out of World War II, U.S. tariffs were very, very high. The blue line there is about 40 to 50% or so, sometimes peaking up to 60% around 1930. Those are the tariffs on imports that compete against domestic goods. Those are really high tariffs. So then you can see as they've just come down. After World War II, into the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of trade agreements in the 1990s. You can see it goes down to low levels. But at the very end there, you can see just that little blip up. That's the Trump effect. He didn't rewind the clock completely and impose really high tariffs, but tariffs did go up under his watch, and they seem to have come down a bit, but that's due to factors we can get into. If there's an intellectual guru behind Trump whose instincts are that trade is bad, it's Robert Lighthizer. The only reason I mention his name is because he has this book here. He was the U.S. trade representative on the first Trump term for all 4 years. He's the one who imposed the tariffs on China, renegotiated the NAFTA, and things of that sort. There's talk that he would come back and possibly be Treasury Secretary or some other high position in the if there was a second Trump administration. So you might be hearing about him. He might even be Secretary of State. It's very hard to say, of course, but he is kept close with the president and very much believes and implemented his trade agenda in his first term. What were the impact of some of those Trump policies? Obviously the president touted them, said they're fantastic. He called himself a tariff man. He said trade wars are good and easy to win. He liked them. But when you look at nonpartisan studies of what the impact was, well, here's something from the Congressional Budget Office, which, even though it's affiliated with Congress, it is independent, it is nonpartisan, and they just sort of represent sort of a consensus view on things. And they talked about how the Trump tariffs in 2020 was going to reduce income by approximately 0.5%, $1,000 or so. So that's a pretty significant hit. That's just saying that if there are gains from trade, if you reduce those gains by imposing tariffs and trade barriers, you lose some income as a result of that. And that's just sort of documenting some of those things. Interestingly, and before I talk about what Trump might be doing or proposing, let's just think about President Biden for a moment, because he's had these 4 years in between Trump administration and what's coming next. When he was a candidate, this is 2019, he sort of attacked Trump or chided him for saying, Trump doesn't get the basics. Trump always insisted, when we impose a tariff on imports, other countries pay those tariffs. Well, if you've taken an economics class, well, the tax is usually paid by consumers. And in this case, it's the U.S. consumers who are buying these imported goods. So those costs in terms of the tariff are going to get passed on to U.S. consumers. And that's what Biden is saying there. At the same time, what's interesting is that Biden himself sort of doesn't think trade's necessarily a great idea. This is just a way of attacking Trump, but he just recently imposed a whole bunch of tariffs on China on steel and aluminum also, but also semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels. And he was proud of that, and he never changed many of the previous tariffs that had been imposed on China or on other countries. He's always embraced American workers, supposedly, and thinking that tariffs help workers. We'll talk about that in a moment because it's not quite the case. But the Biden administration really didn't change much in terms of U.S. trade policy. Now, they'll say, of course, we are different. I don't know whether this is popular in Israel, but memes, my students are always coming up with memes on various things. And so I have no idea what this one is, except I know what the text is. It's probably from some movie or television show. The Biden administration would say, well, these tariffs, they're not like the Trump tariffs. They're not regular tariffs. These are strategic tariffs. They're really trying to achieve something different. They're trying to help with the green transition. They're trying to help reindustrialize America and help out the auto industry. I mean, one problem there, of course, is if we're imposing tariffs on solar panels, that's very much against the green transition because cheap solar panels really make a difference when consumers are thinking about going solar as opposed to other forms of electricity. So what is President Trump talking about in terms of a second term and what he might do? As Bob mentioned on the campaign trail, he's talked about the fact that he's not done with his tariffs, that he wants a 10% across the board tariff on imports, a 50% tax on goods from China. So the 10% would be on top of that. So it would be 60% on all goods from China. And that's sort of his basic opening stance. He also has said that we should abolish the income tax in the United States, which sounds like a great idea, of course, but then the question is, how do you finance your expenditures? He would want to replace it with an import tariff, once again, in this idea that other countries are paying the tariff, not U.S. consumers, a contention of which there is no evidence. So it really mean changing to a consumption tax of sorts in the United States. And we'll get to the problems with that in a moment. Withdrawal from the WTO, he hasn't sort of mentioned that yet, but that could be on the table as well. Of course, Bob asked a great question. So why are you imposing these tariffs? What's the goal? So he would say the goal is to raise revenue. So a tariff, he'd say, would be better than an income tax. We can cut people's income taxes. We'll get to that in a moment, how that's really not feasible, simply because the U.S. doesn't import enough to tax to fund the entire federal government spending. And also he'd say we'd want this to eliminate the trade deficit. We'd want it to bring back jobs. In other words, he thinks it's going to make America stronger. So let's sort of think about some of these things. So there have been various studies that have been done just in the past couple of weeks trying to catch up with the ideas that Trump is throwing out there. And this is one by the Tax Foundation, which has studied the impact of various taxes on the U.S. economy. And notice the headline here: a new trade war could wipe out the growth from tax reform. So the President Trump and Congress passed a tax cut in 2017 after he first got into office. That's known as the TCJA there, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. All those tax cuts were temporary. So the idea of Trump proposing a change would be, well, we want to make those changes permanent. And this is, according to their economic model, what would be the impact of making the income tax changes permanent? Raise GDP by 0.5%. Make the estate tax change permanent. That would raise it another 0.1%, so it raises the gains from that tax reform up to 0.6. If you make the business tax changes, that's 0.5% of GDP. So now you're gaining an extra 1.1% in GDP from these tax cuts. And if you lower the corporate tax rate just a little bit, it's not much, but you'll get a little bit more income as well. But the point is, if you combine a renewal of those old tax cuts with the tax hike that's implicit in a tariff, boom. First of all, that 1.2% gain you get to GDP, it shrinks to 0.54%. In other words, you lose 0.8% of GDP with that. That's very similar to what the CBO had estimated earlier with those tax increases. And then compounding it, if other countries retaliate, that's the last line there, then the U.S. loses almost 0.5% of GDP. And then all the gains that come from those making those temporary tax cuts permanent are lost because you're losing gains from trade. You're losing benefits of those agreements. Now, the last one there is important. Foreign countries retaliate. So there's always the question, will foreign countries retaliate? During the first term of the Trump administration, the U.S. Was sort of assured by the administration that other countries won't bother to retaliate. They'll be either too afraid, or it's not going to have such a big impact on them, or what have you. Well, in fact, China did retaliate against the U.S. The European Union retaliated against the U.S. And when the EU did it, this is what they said. So this is Jan-Claude Juncker, who was the European Commission president at the time. He said, we can do stupid. And so you can see the text there, but he's saying this is a stupid process. The United States imposed all these tariffs for stupid reasons, and now we stupidly have to follow suit and impose tariffs on you because we can't let you get away with this. So we're going to retaliate. If you're going to affect our exports to you, we're going to tax your exports to us. And that sort of negates trade and negates all the benefits that come with trade. So we have to be stupid. And so these are some of the products they picked. And of course, those are not random products. Levi's, Bourbon, Harley Davidson's, they're picking products made in certain congressional districts and states that are very politically sensitive to extract as much political pain from the US as possible. If you read the Financial Times, which a nice paper from Britain, I highly recommend for international news. The European Union is preparing again for a trade plan to quote unquote tackle Donald Trump if he's reelected. And the two-step trade plan is, first of all, offer some sort of agreement where they will limit their exports to the U.S. if the U.S. limits how much tariffs we impose or something like that. But then, of course, the plan is for retaliation. So it says they're talking about a carrot and stick approach. So rest be assured, if there's no sort of exemption given for the EU or some sort of agreement that is not reached, the EU will retaliate against the US for that any tariffs that imposes. So in other words, if the US imposes a 10% tariff, you can be sure the European Union is going to impose about a 10% tariff as well on US goods. That's known as a trade war. That will just diminish trade. It diminishes any benefits, slim they might be, from a unilateral imposition of the tariff, even though the consequences are basically for the own economy. There's some stuff I can send you, or you can access online from the Peterson Institute on can tariffs replace the income tax? Well, the answer is no, because we don't import enough. And if we tax those imports a lot to get a lot of revenue, imports would shrink, the tax base would shrink. So it's really unattainable to replace the income the income tax with a tariff. So that's not going to happen. If they do try to move in that direction and cut taxes and raise tariffs to make up the revenue, it'll just make the federal deficit bigger, and that will have an impact on the U.S. dollar. It'll have a impact on U.S. interest rates. And there's a big question about how long the U.S. can run such a big fiscal deficit and still get away with it. Here's just something. This is also from the Tax Commission, the Tax Foundation. And once again, if you look at the lower left there, it's talking about what's the long-run GDP impact of imposing higher tariffs, what's the impact on the capital stock and the number of jobs, and it's negative, negative, negative. So it's really hard to find a reason or a rationale that these tariffs will help out the U.S. economy overall. Once again, President Trump would say, oh, I'm helping manufacturing in particular. But the problem with those tariffs is when you impose them on inputs like steel, you hurt all the industries that are using steel as an input. I don't know about you, but I don't go out and buy a bar of steel. But we buy cars, we buy houses that have a lot of steel embedded in them, and those are the prices that will go up as a result of that. Just a couple of other points. Tariffs are also very regressive. So the blue and the red lines there are showing that as you move up to higher income levels, changes in those other big tax cuts will tend to help the wealthier in the U.S. rather than the poorer. But the tariffs, they hurt the poor more than they do the rich. So it's regressive in that sense. You're taxing poor, lower income households because they spend more of their goods, more of their income rather, on imports, apparel that we get from China, and products such as that, basic electronics and what have you. So higher income groups, they can afford the tariffs in some sense, but lower income groups, they could lose the lowest quintile here. It says 4% cut to their purchasing power, which is their after-tax income. That's pretty significant hurt that's being imposed there. There's another one just showing that this is from the Peterson Institute, looking at the tariff distribution. And once again, it shows basically the same thing. So just confirming what the other economists found, that lower quintiles in the income distribution we'll see bigger income losses as a result of the tariff increases that might be coming, as opposed to higher income households. So what's sort of the bottom line? If President Trump we could talk about President Harris and her trade agenda too, a little bit less interesting, but Trump will really mix things up sort of as he did during his first term. First of all, it'll put really trade issues back on the agenda. I don't know how much you followed it, but for his first 2 or 3 years in office, every week there were new articles and new proposals that the administration was contemplating about imposing tariffs, ripping up trade agreements, things of that sort. Now, there is bipartisan support in the U.S. for measures against China. So if the Biden administration, as I mentioned, just imposed higher tariffs on some certain goods from China, the strategic tariffs, the Trump administration would certainly impose higher tariffs against China as well. No one in the U.S. really objects to that. And also, it doesn't really affect U.S. imports, because what we don't import from China, we can import from Vietnam or Malaysia or Mexico or things like that. So there's a lot of trade diversion away from China that is being suggested for economic reasons, strategic reasons, political reasons. There's also a lot of bipartisan support for industrial policy, something we can talk about, that is subsidies for, say, the semiconductor industry or for the car industry in making electric vehicles. But I guess the worrisome sign for me is that Trump really doesn't care about hitting allies or starting these trade wars. He's not really trying to fine-tune economic effects. He's not trying to get allies on the international scene to support U.S. Trade policy. He sort of views it as a way of getting back at other countries for, quote unquote, things they've done to us in the past, taking our jobs and what have you. Just on subsidies, I would note that I heard an Israeli entrepreneur or policymaker recently speaking about how this created some difficulties for Israel, because high tech and semiconductors are very important in Israel, and that when the U.S. offers these subsidies for Intel or other manufacturers to establish plants in the U.S., well, there's always a chance they could have established some facilities in Israel and elsewhere, and they're getting drawn away because of those subsidies. What we expect to see, more tweets from the president, President Trump, if he's reelected. Here's just some old ones saying trade wars are good and easy to win. You can't lose a trade war when you're $800 billion down in terms of the trade deficit. We've been getting ripped off for years. And ultimately, I think, as I predicted or said in 2018, this is an exercise in futility. It's not going to really bring a lot of jobs back. It's not going to reduce the trade deficit, because the trade deficit is driven by macroeconomic factors such as capital flows between countries. A lot of what the president might do with tariffs would be undone by exchange rate effects. So yes, we might be able to block imports, but that would tend to strengthen the dollar, those tariffs, and that will cut into U.S. exports. So any jobs we gain in terms of import competing industries in the United States will lose in terms of export-oriented industries. So why don't I stop there? Let's see if I have another slide. Nope, that's it. So I'd love to address any questions you have and hear any comments or get some feedback from you.
Are there any reputable economists who would support what Trump is saying? I mean, he's talking as a politician. Most economists I know think this is a bad idea. Are there reputable economists who would say, no, this is a good idea? And if they are saying it, why are they saying it?
Good question. The short answer is no. The two main people, well, actually, let me back up a bit. The two main people are Robert Lighthizer, of course, as I mentioned, who is the U.S. Trade Representative. He also has another advisor named Peter Navarro, who has a PhD in economics from Harvard, taught at University of California, Irvine, and for some reason is bought into this and thinks that protection would be good for the U.S. So he's a PhD economist, but he doesn't have quite the standing within the profession, or certainly share the same views as many people in the profession. There are, what's interesting is some groups on the right. I'm thinking about someone named Orrin Cass, who was an advisor to Mitt Romney in his 2016 campaign, I believe, or maybe 2012. And he sort of flipped on trade policy. Now, he's not an economist, but he endorses a lot of these higher tariffs and what have you. But I guess the straight answer is, I don't think there are any reputable senior economists who are advising the Trump campaign and that think that these tariffs would be a good idea.
I'm alumni. I'm doing a master's in natural language processing. in Rajam University. This will be a software developer. So I think the most obvious question is, okay, so Trump is bad for economics. What about Kamala Harris in these kind of criteria and terms? Thank you.
Yes. The quick answer is we don't know so much about Kamala Harris because she was a senator before and an attorney or a prosecutor. Then as vice president, you basically have to fall in line and agree with the president. Now, she comes from California, which is a different state than Joe Biden came from Delaware and sort of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a swing state that has a large steel industry. So that's one reason why President Biden did not get rid of those steel tariffs and actually sort of agreed with Trump on many things in terms of the damage that imports, he would say, have caused to the U.S. So Biden and Trump, not so much different on trade policy, although Biden was much more interested in working with allies. But Harris is coming from California. California is a much more dynamic place. That's sort of the center of high tech in the U.S. It's much more outward looking, much more export oriented, less of the old Rust Belt industries that have been hurt as a result of imports. So one would think that she would have a more pro-trade stance. But we really don't know. She also tends to be on the progressive side or progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is a little more anti-trade. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what if there's a Harris administration, where she sort of comes down. I think she would have more reputable economists advising her. They would probably say that it's not a good idea to impose taxes on trade. There are other more constructive things you can do that would be damaging for the economy. So I think that it wouldn't be that much of a change from the Biden administration, and possibly even a more willingness to open up and consider talking positively and constructively about trade with other countries, possibly reducing some of those tariffs. So I'd be a little bit more optimistic about a Harris administration in terms of trade policy than a Trump administration.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm a lawyer for the IDF, who also likes economics. Question, would you anticipate, or do you think it's possible that these procedures, policies that you discussed could possibly lead to general dollar appreciation, which could also lead, I think, to more deadweight loss in terms of the actual trades due to impact on imports? Or is that, taking it too far ahead of time?
No, that's absolutely right. So I think the general view and some of these models, which once again, if you go to the Peterson Institute website, PIIE.com, or the Tax Foundation website, where they talk about some of their simulations that they've run, a lot of reasons why trade policy isn't very effective is because in terms of achieving the objectives that its proponents want, is the exchange rate effects. So if the U.S. had a 10% across the board tariff on imports, that would tend to appreciate the dollar, which would first of all make U.S. imports cheaper and sort of countervail the impact of those tariffs, and also make U.S. exports more expensive to foreign consumers and hurt U.S. exports. So in other words, the tariff wouldn't reduce imports by nearly as much as you might think, and the tariffs would actually have this negative impact on U.S. exports. So the exchange rate effects are can be very significant, and I think you're absolutely right. The more the U.S. tries to limit trade, the more that would put upward pressure on the dollar.
Thanks.
I have a question. I'd like to focus more on China specifically. So there are at least two main arguments about China. Is that even I heard some free market economists say that one, China steals intellectual property, and therefore you should trade with them less because they steal all the ideas. Another thing I heard is, of course, China they're just bad, and we don't want to trade with them because they're a bad state. They want to attack Taiwan. They want to do all kinds of bad stuff. So we just don't want to trade with them as a sort of like punishment. So what do you say to both of those arguments?
I'd say there's some other arguments in addition to them. So I think it's pretty well documented and well known that China steals intellectual property. I sort of saw that firsthand. I've only been to China once, but we went on a tour of a Dannon yogurt factory. And it was this big building, steam with very new stainless steel, huge tanks for dairy milk and what have you to make yogurt. And one of the plant managers said, 6 months after we opened this factory, another one using exactly the same technology was opened up just down the street with 3 times the capacity of our plant. And basically implying where did they get that technology and how did they adopt it so quickly? One thing that Dan told us was that we said, well, if they're producing so much and using the same technology right down the street, how can you're still in business? And they said it was branding, that people in China trust Dannon brand. It's represents high quality, whereas the plant down the street was sort of a no-name Chinese brand, and consumers in China wanted the Western brand. So that's the only reason they can charge a premium and still get away and still make some money in China. So I think the question always is, if there's a bad practice that you've identified, what's the optimal response? If China's stealing intellectual property, should the U.S. federal government do anything? U.S. multinationals are going in there knowing that could happen. They would have to make a decision about whether to do so or not. If we impose tariffs, is it just for punishment, or is it trying to change their behavior? Are we trying to bring them to the negotiating table so that they don't steal intellectual property? I'm not sure that would happen. The second part you mentioned, the one I would add is national security. So a lot of people say, yes, they're just a bad actor. We don't like them, so we don't want to trade with them. But the more potent argument in Washington is actually it's dangerous for the U.S. to trade with China, because then we become dependent on them for certain sources of supply of important commodities. It could be memory chips, semiconductors. It could be cranes that we use in our ports that might be, monitoring U.S. activity. It could be that semiconductors embedded in cars, and whether they're monitoring, where people are going, and possibly could even turn off those cars remotely from Beijing. And therefore, we want to, as the Trump administration would say, is really disengage and decouple our economy from China's for national security reasons and safety reasons. That's one reason why there's been a ban on Huawei in the U.S., saying that, okay, they might help build 5G networks in our country, but it also gives them access to a lot of data that they could use against us at some reason in the future. There's even some fears, that cyber security has been breached with China, in the sense that they could shut down the U.S. electrical grid or really affect U.S. security. So then the question becomes, I don't have access to the intelligence, but what's the response? And how do we do that? And how do we do that without alienating allies? And how do we, punish China? And there, I think there's no clear economic answer per se. It's a question of targeting your response to the outcome that you want to achieve. But as even Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, defense is more important than opulence. National security is an important objective. And if interfering with trade helps that objective, that's something that should be on the table. So sorry to be wishy-washy, but I just say that there's a lot of debate about what exactly the U.S. policy should be vis-a-vis China, and what our policy response should be to various policies they've undertaken.
I'm Shaked, an AI researcher. So I want to ask a little bit more about the national defense, and say that apart from what you mentioned, it might be beneficial to have not only to not be dependent, but also to actually have all of the industries that you need during wartime in the US. And so the best example is the auto industry during the Second World War, which was converted into building tanks and vehicles, which probably impacted the outcomes of the war significantly. So my question is basically, do you think it would be better, instead of tariffs, just to have subsidies for industries that might be beneficial during wartime?
Generally, there's been a long, first of all, great question. Thank you very much. There's long been a debate among economists about, if you want to help out a certain industry or protect it for whatever reason, what's the best way to do it? Through a tariff or through a subsidy? And there are a lot of good arguments for subsidies. It's much more transparent. It's much more direct. It doesn't hurt consumers directly. And it doesn't lead to retaliation necessarily. So there would be an argument for subsidizing certain industries in the US. And I think that was the motivation behind the CHIPS Act, is to bring more semiconductor production back to the US so that we're not quite as dependent on South Korea. And in fact, the whole world's dependent on South Korea and Taiwan for a lot of these chips. Not that we're not friends with Taiwan and South Korea, of course we are, but they're in very vulnerable areas, one with China right next to it and the other with North Korea looming over it. And so on prudential grounds, the argument goes that we want to diversify and have some more semiconductor production in Europe, in the US, and in other countries. To the point of subsidies, that also raises the question, okay, so what industries deserve or need these subsidies? The national security argument would say that, look, we buy most of our drones from China, and drones are going to be very important. First of all, we don't want Chinese drones monitoring developments in the US, but we also need to have our own capability of producing drones here. And so maybe we should be subsidizing the drone industry. You know, warfare, as you know all too well, unfortunately, has become very technology intensive, and it's changing very rapidly. And the people of Ukraine are discovering this as well. And it's not just tanks and ships anymore. It's a lot of tech and drones and what have you. And so it's something the Pentagon and defense establishments always have to sort of keep up. What is the next thing? What's going to be the next more important industry that we'll really need to have some domestic capability of? And that's a very difficult thing to do. I'd say yes, at least in the US, there is renewed support for helping ensure that we are secure in terms of national defense capabilities, including domestic production, and subsidies are a part of that.
Hi, I'm Ariel, and I'm a PhD student in economics.
Oh, great. Okay. I know it's not fun. It's not a fun process, but I hope, but it's a worthwhile one at the end of the day.
I hope so too. So the question is, there are a lot of, I don't know, call them apologists who say that Trump is playing this 3D chess game where he's actually very much a free trader and a conservative in economics, but currently what you have is unfair trade because of all the things that you said about intellectual property, and the primary objective of the trade war is to threaten the trade war and then actually get actual free trade. Just what's your response to that? Is there even such a thing as pure free trade, or is just, theoretical?
Yeah, well, if you look at the title of Lighthizer book, I think it's called "No Trade is Free." So certainly he his major advisor, doesn't think that even free trade is an objective. I know Trump has said at some point, I am a free trader. I just want open and balanced on each side. But the problem is, I guess, is if he's playing 3D chess, he's really hiding that third dimension very well, and we don't see it. So, the new NAFTA is not really that different from the old NAFTA. It's just a little bit more protectionist. So in terms of getting a better deal, there's not much of a better deal to have than you cut your tariffs to zero and we'll cut our tariffs to zero. That's what we had with NAFTA. That's what we have with the U.S.-Israel Free Trade Agreement. He doesn't like the outcomes, which is that U.S. imports more and that we might have a trade deficit. But those outcomes are not dependent on the agreement so much. The trade deficit has to do with capital flows between countries, and the loss of manufacturing has much more to do with technology than imports. Also, by pulling out of the TPP without even trying to negotiate it, if it's playing 3D chess, he'd come back and say, I don't like the current TPP, but here's my idea, or here's how we're going to renegotiate it or rebrand it like he did with NAFTA. But he just simply didn't like the whole idea of it, and so he pulled out without trying to re-engage on trade. So if you think about trade as being, or trade policy as being this carrot and the stick, he's very good at using the stick, but not so much with the carrot. And certainly at the end of his first term, we weren't any closer to having more open, free, and fair trade than we were at the beginning of his term. We had just had a lot of trade barriers.
Doug, let me just go into a slightly different subject for a minute, since we have a little time and you seem to be okay with spending more time with us. How about the issue of sanctions? That's really a big discussion these days. And now the United States has been using this as a tool, punish Russia, Iran. I've seen some data that really basically what they're doing is taking all this stuff and just moving it towards China, and basically just redefining the global economy. So I guess I would say, number one, what's your opinion about sanctions as a policy tool to achieve objectives, and do they work?
Yeah, I'd say the evidence is very mixed on whether they work. The first point is that if you're sanctioning a country such as Russia, it's not good enough for the U.S. to do that unilaterally. Or if we're sanctioning China, it's not good enough to do it unilaterally. You have to get sort of a bunch of allies to support that. So if we were trying to deny advanced semiconductor equipment to China, we could put a ban on U.S. exports, but then the Netherlands, which is a major producer of semiconductor etching equipment, if we don't get them on board, basically the sanctions are meaningless. So sanctions only work or have a chance of working well if you have a coalition of countries that are willing to do that. And traditionally, Europe's been relatively weak with respect to Russia, and other Asian countries have been weak with respect to China, because anytime the U.S. imposes some sort of ban, there's an incentive for other countries to sort of fill that void. So as someone pointed out, U.S. exports or Western European exports to, I think it's Kazakhstan, have just soared since the Ukraine war started. It's not because those exports to Russia plummeted, but what that indicates is probably there's just a lot of transshipment through other countries. And then there's financial sanctions too. And here the U.S. has enormous power in terms of its control over the international financial system. But the more we exercise that power, interestingly, we sort of undermine its effectiveness in the future, because you create the incentive for China and other countries, as you mentioned, to develop their own systems outside of the U.S. purview. And then so you're sort of balkanizing the world economy in that way. So I think sanctions obviously have a very important role, and they can indeed punish others, but unless they're crafted well, they're not going to have nearly as much impact as one might hope. And that one usually has to do it in coalition, in concert with other countries. And the one last point I would make is that the U.S. Tends to be sanction happy. I think if you look at the numbers of just the number of countries and sectors where we've imposed sanctions of one sort or another, we have sanctions all over the place. And I think that sort of indicates it's the easiest thing to do. It feels good when you do it, but doesn't necessarily mean it's well designed and will have the effect that you hope.
Okay, so who's gonna win the election, though?
Well, as I said, if you'd asked me, 2 weeks ago, it looked like Trump had a very, very good chance of winning, particularly because he had a lead in the, you can look at the national polls, but it really comes down to about 4 or 5 states, such as, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, maybe Nevada. So those are the states to watch, because the voters are not changing in Massachusetts or in Texas or in California. But Harris has really changed things up quite a bit. There's a lot of enthusiasm for her, particularly among younger people. And what that suggests is that turnout is going to be very important. So the polls could be 50-50, but it really depends on who's energized in early November to turn out. And that will be perhaps the determining factor. So I'd say 2 weeks ago, I'd say it looks like Trump, and now I'd say it's very unclear. It's going to be very close. And it's a little bit too early to say exactly how Harris has been doing, but there certainly seems to have energized the Democrats. So I'd say it's a toss-up at the moment.
Hi, my name is Moshe. I have a BA in technology management. I would like to ask 2 questions. First of all, what do you think about the BRICS? Basically, so not exactly on the subject, but what do you think about the BRICS pulling out of the petrodollar agreement, and what's the implications on the dollar? And the second question, what do you think about Trump talking about buying 5% of the supply for as a strategic reserve for the US government?
Oh, of Bitcoin?
Yes, sir.
Yep. I think that's ridiculous. I don't see what maybe that's something that some of his Bitcoin friends have whispered in his ear, but I'm not sure what strategic purpose that would accomplish. And with the U.S. large fiscal deficit, it just seems like a waste when we could be stockpiling and investing more in defense or other areas that could be more directly productive. On the first, that's one of those developments where I think that the U.S. has sort of exerted itself a little bit, maybe too much, in terms of using the dollar as a weapon. And so then you get other countries saying we want to get out of that system and use either a different currency or different methods of payments. And I guess I don't know enough about it to say specifically. I'd be skeptical about whether it's really hard to escape the dollar. And in terms of pricing in markets and as a medium of exchange internationally, but the mere fact that countries are expressing the desire to get away from it, I think, is an indication about sort of frustration with the U.S. Control and the use of sanctions to achieve various objectives. So I'm not sure they'll be successful, but I think it's something to keep one's eye on in terms of whether it works out and whether you can go from a dollar system to a two-currency system or having two separate parts of the world economy in that way.
Okay,
All right.
well, we look forward to having you back soon. Thank you so much, Doug.
Take care. Very nice to see you all.